As we saw in the previous video, the Western-influenced UN is trying to force Muslim countries, like Sudan, to approve CEDAW, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. CEDAW is an international treaty that claims to fight for women's rights, but behind this very inspiring title, some of its articles come into direct conflict with our identity as Muslims. The implementation of these articles will go against the very core of Muslim life and target the family institution, which, according to Islam and the well-established judicial practices in Sudan, is the building block that holds our society together. So how exactly will CEDAW do this? The first statement that calls for our attention is Article 2, Section F, which forces governments to take all appropriate measures to modify or abolish any laws that constitute discrimination against women. This article contradicts the transitional nature of the current Sudanese government, which is trying to amend the personal status law for Muslims through an illegitimate committee and under the absence of the parliament, even though it has no mandate to modify or abolish any laws and impose a specific ideology on its citizens. Like Sarah, a young Sudanese girl. Under the slogan of female empowerment and the Western definition of discrimination adopted by CEDAW, Sarah will be granted complete sexual freedom, as well as freedom to choose her own sex, her own sexual partners, her own dress code, and free access to contraception, setting off an avalanche of terrible consequences like sexual promiscuity, prostitution, single parenting, and free access to abortion that would inevitably lead to the moral bankruptcy of our Muslim societies. For instance, the explosion of sexual activity thanks to contraception in the West has brought levels of cohabitation, divorce, abortion, and pornography addiction never before seen in history, leading to an epidemic of single-parent families and fatherless children, which statistics show are twice as likely to drop out of high school, 2.5 times as likely to become teen mothers, and 1.4 times as likely to be idle, out of school, and out of work. Today, with 320 million children living in single-parent families, the U.S. and the Western world have the highest share of single parenting in the world. Other articles that call for our immediate attention are Article 5, Section A, and Article 16, which states that every law based on traditional gender roles could be considered discriminatory, including all issues concerning marriage, divorce, inheritance, and property rights. Let's say Sarah has decided to honor Islamic laws and marry Adam, following traditional roles with the marriage and even considering becoming a polygamous couple. But CEDAW would see these practices as sexist and abusive to Sarah's rights, even if both parties already agree to them. CEDAW would also make sure that Islamic inheritance laws are overturned, even if women inherit more than men in most cases, and that Sarah can be legally protected to have sexual intercourse outside of marriage. As you can see, this is a direct attack on the institution of marriage that will have devastating effects. For instance, Sarah would lose her God-given right to nafaka, or the financial sustenance of the husband. This means that Sarah would be forced to get a job, giving up her choice to become a full-time mother and housewife, and causing great harm to the family unit and especially to her child, who would see the warmth and nurture of a family environment be replaced by the coldness and indifference of a childcare program, or worse yet, by the secular and often disastrous values that kids learn from modern media. If Sharia imposes nafaka on the husband so the mother can provide good care to the child, especially during the first 2 years, is it worth the social, emotional, and behavioral challenges that studies show are more common in children exposed to early daycare and absent parents? However, Adam and Sarah have stayed true to their Islamic values and even welcomed a baby into their home, little Amal. But CEDAW would allow Sarah to register Amal without a marriage certificate or only under her family name. If both parents should have a say and provide strong parental roles in the upbringing of their child, why would CEDAW want to undermine Adam's role in the life of Amal? And yet, CEDAW's interference in Muslims' family affairs heads into increasingly dangerous territory. The convention states that same-sex marriage, sexual orientation, and gender identity should be recognized and even promoted. This means that A man can dress up and pose as a woman or vice versa. 2 women or 2 men should be able to establish a marriage, start a family, and display their affection in public. Sex education should start early at school, including topics like LGBTQ rights and gender identity. And anyone could claim to be a female and be recognized by law as one, even children. So, if homosexual acts are forbidden in traditional Islamic codes, should Adam and Sarah feel comfortable exposing themselves and little Amal to them? And once this lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender propaganda is recognized to comply with Western demands, how long before it becomes normalized in our society and taught in our children's schools? Does this also mean that little Amal would grow up in a society that embraces not only immoral ideas about sexuality, but indecent ones about gender? Now, the transitional government is arguing that Sudan should join the treaty and make reservations on it, like most of Muslim-majority countries did. But these reservations are inconsistent with our society values and the state legal system. So it's fair to ask, did the reservations really help protect Islamic traditions in these countries? In Palestine, for instance, NGOs have submitted shadow reports that force the government to amend West Bank and Gaza penal codes, to decriminalize abortion and ensure safe, legal access to abortion, adopt legislation that prohibits all forms of discrimination and violence on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, repeal Article 284 of the Criminal Code prohibiting zina, or sexual intercourse outside of marriage, raise the minimum age of marriage to 18, allow women to give birth in a hospital and register their children without a marriage certificate or under a family name of their choice, and ensure that children do not suffer discrimination due to the parents' marital status. Repeal the provision in the Penal Code that allows parents to discipline their children, and repeal the mandate that criminalizes carnal knowledge. In Malaysia, the same type of reports are pushing the government to amend its penal code and legalize practices like same-sex sexual practices and cross-dressing, ban polygamy for Muslim men, sex segregation in public transport, and provisions that do not recognize marital rape, and allow for public displays of vulgarity like festivals that celebrate sexual liberation and inappropriate children books, which go against the moral values set by the Islamic tradition of the country. Meanwhile, in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi is attempting to legalize adult consensual sexual relations in private by repealing or amending indecency offenses in the Penal Code. The treaty is also pushing the government to allow women to acquire birth certificates without the requirement of a marriage certificate. Lastly, the abusive cultural and legal impositions carried out by Saudi in Pakistan want the government to repeal hudud laws, legalize abortion, and, more alarmingly, abolish the federal Sharia court, which derives from God's immutable law and must be protected by all Muslims. As you can see, the discrimination that Saudi claims to fight is the same discrimination that it wants to impose on the Sudanese people and Muslims around the world, forcing us to go against the sacred discourse of Islam and creating confusion and confrontation that will only divide us instead of uniting us. The current situation in Sudan is a wake-up call for all Muslim societies to promote a healthy interaction with modern ideas while exercising our freedom of religion and way of life in line with Islamic ethical and moral values. Let's all stand up under this anti-Islamic and undemocratic reforms that are currently sweeping the nation, and help protect Adam, Sarah, and Amal from the destruction of the Muslim family.